The 1980s saw the transition of two eras. During the decade, Larry O'Brien passed the reins over to David Stern. During that time, the ratings were dwindling. At this time, the NBA started to take off as its popularity began to rise. And don't forget, arguably, the greatest draft class in NBA history happened exactly that year, in 1984. Now when you speak about the 80s in the NBA, two things come into mind immediately: the Los Angeles Lakers and the Boston Celtics. More specifically, Magic Johnson and Larry Bird. However, there are more than the Lakers and the Celtics when it comes to the NBA in the 1980s. There are other noteworthy players and teams aside from the two powerhouses. More specifically, there were other duos who could compete with the Lakers and the Celtics. Unfortunately, they just didn't have the bench just as deep. I'm Ben Cuevas from What's on Sports. Let's take a closer look at the best duos of the 80s in the NBA. Ralph Sampson and Hakeem Olajuwon. While fans argue that Michael Jordan should have gotten the top pick in 1984, the actual top pick proved his worth early in the 80s. With the first pick in the 1984 NBA draft, the Houston Rockets selected Hakeem Olajuwon. Then known without the H, Olajuwon and Ralph Sampson was the first ever legitimate Twin Towers in the NBA. With their center at 7 feet and his teammate standing at 7'4", the opponent's frontline didn't stand a chance. In just his second season, Olajuwon and Sampson led the Rockets to the NBA Finals, and the future seemed bright for the Twin Towers. Unfortunately, the injury bug bothered Sampson, which forced the Rockets to trade him away after only 4 seasons of his partnership with Hakeem. It became one of the biggest what-ifs, as we only witnessed Sampson's potential as a rare giant who could run the break. Isaiah Thomas and Joe Dumars. This was a tough one because the Detroit Pistons dominated the NBA at the end of the decade and at the start of the 90s. But the bad boys gave everyone fits during the decade. In fact, the duo of Isaiah Thomas and Joe Dumars could only brag what the NBA duos can't. They were the only two who eliminated Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, and Michael Jordan in their primes. And not a lot of teams could do that with just one of them. The Pistons defeated the Celtics in the Eastern Conference Finals in 1988. Detroit swept the Lakers in 1989. And the Chicago Bulls were their whipping boys for 3 consecutive playoffs from 1988 to 1990. If Dumars was drafted 3 years earlier, the Pistons would probably be in the mix for title contention throughout the 80s. Moses Malone and Dr. J. The 1983 Philadelphia 76ers was one of the greatest teams in NBA history. Remember when Moses Malone declared "Fo fo fo"? Malone almost fulfilled a prophecy as the Sixers finished the playoffs with a 12-1 record, which back then was the best playoff standing in the NBA. While Malone provided the power, Julius Erving showcased the finesse. From 1981 to 1983, both Malone and Erving occupied the list of MVPs during that span. Malone won 2, while Dr. J won his only MVP trophy in 1981. The duo led the Sixers to 3 NBA Final stints, winning 1 championship in the process. Larry Bird and Kevin McHale. If we're talking about duos, it's hard to pick between Kevin McHale and Robert Parrish to be paired with Larry Bird, but McHale has more of a parallel career with Larry Legend. They began their NBA careers 1 season apart. Bird retired in 1992, while McHale followed suit 2 seasons later. Both players were Hall of Famers, were the top scorers of the Celtics during the decade. Thanks to Boston's tandem, the Celtics reached the NBA Finals 5 times and won 3. If you put Parrish in the conversation, the Celtics had the greatest frontline ever assembled in the NBA. Magic Johnson and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. The Celtics had Parrish as their number 3 guy. Their rivals, the Los Angeles Lakers, were just as potent. The Lakers considered James Worthy the third best behind Johnson and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar for most of the decade. That's how powerful the Lakers were in the 1980s. But the focus was mostly on Magic and Kareem. They are always in the discussion of the greatest duos in NBA history. Basically up there with Jordan Pippen, Kobe and Shaq, and Russell and Cousy. Together, the tandem won 5 NBA championships, 8 finals appearances. The decade belonged to the Lakers, and nobody in the West came close. Well, except for the Rockets, who won the 2 seasons in the West during the decade, and one of them was a lucky buzzer beater by Sampson in 1986. Magic Johnson and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar will probably be considered the best duo in the 1980s. And those are your best duos in the NBA during the 1980s. I'm Ben Cuevas from Watson Sports. For more content just like this, head on over to watsonsports.com.